Welcome back to Detective Podcast. Tonight's story creeps out of the shadows. But before we step inside, tell us, where in the world are you listening from? Drop your city and country in the comments and become part of our growing circle of curious minds. Now, settle in, the investigation begins. Chapter 1. The village of Larchcombe had always trusted its bells. They were old bells, older than the cobbled square, older even than the habit of counting time by hours instead of prayers. Their voices were not loud, but they were certain. They rang for weddings with a careful joy, for funerals with a gravity that felt almost personal, and for Sundays with the mild insistence of something that had learned patience centuries before the villagers had. That was why the sound at midnight caused such unease. It was not the ringing itself that disturbed Larchcombe, but the manner of it. The bells rang neither joyfully nor solemnly. They rang as though remembering something they had been forbidden to say aloud. Mrs. Fenwick was the first to hear them. She woke with the uncomfortable sensation that she had been summoned rather than startled. Sitting upright in her narrow bed, she counted the strokes with a precision born of devotion rather than habit. 12. No more, no less. The sound came from St. Aldhelm's tower, steady and deliberate. "There's no service," she whispered, crossing herself. Across the green, lights flickered on in other cottages. Dogs barked, then fell silent, as if reproved. Within minutes, the bells had done their work. People were awake. And when the final echo faded into the cold air, a fear took its place, neat, controlled, and oddly respectful. By morning, the story had learned to walk. "They rang by themselves," said Mrs. Fenwick, with the quiet triumph of one whose fears had found confirmation. "They rang for judgment," murmured old Mr. Hale, who had lost a son and found consolation in symbols ever since. "They rang because something was wrong," said Julian Markham, the young organist's assistant, though he did not say what. By the time the constable arrived at St. Aldhelm's shortly after dawn, the bells had already acquired motives. The tower door was locked. That too would have been unremarkable, had the bell ringer not been inside. Thomas Reed had rung the bells at St. Aldhelm's for 30 years. He was a thin man with narrow shoulders and a habit of arriving early, as though punctuality were a form of prayer. He lived alone, spoke rarely, and knew the bells as other men know their own moods. He was not given to midnight excursions, and he was certainly not given to locking himself into the tower after dark. Yet there he lay at the foot of the bell-frame, his body oddly composed, his hands folded as though in apology. He was dead. Dr. Lowe pronounced it with professional restraint. The cause would come later. What troubled him immediately was not the body but the room. "There's no sign of a struggle," he said, "and no sign of entry." The constable nodded grimly. The door was bolted from the inside. The narrow stone stair leading up the tower showed no disturbance. Dust lay thick and honest upon each step, recording nothing more dramatic than age. "And the ropes?" Mr. Price asked sharply. Mr. Price, chairman of the parish council, had arrived early, and with purpose. He did not believe in superstition, and took a certain pride in disbelieving it publicly. The constable examined them again. "Still tied, exactly as they were left after evening practice." Julian Markham swallowed. "Then how—" "No one touched them," Price snapped, "which means someone is lying." At this point, Father Brown was standing quietly near the tower arch, examining a chipped carving of St. Michael weighing souls with scales worn nearly smooth by time. No one had invited him. No one had thought to ask why he was there. He had arrived that morning on foot, having intended only to attend a quiet weekday mass before continuing on his way. He was a small man, round of face and mild of expression, dressed in a threadbare cassock that suggested neither importance nor urgency. He listened with the patience of one who had learned that people reveal more when they believe they are being overheard, rather than observed. "They rang," Mrs. Fenwick insisted, clutching her shawl. "I heard them, and so did God." Father Brown looked up mildly. "God," he said, "hears many things we do not." Price turned. "And sometimes," he said coldly, "people hear what they expect." The body was removed with care, the bells left untouched. By noon the tower was sealed, and the village gathered in clusters, whispering theories as one might pass around a dangerous object, carefully and with interest. "The dead call the living," said Mr. Hale. "Bells don't ring themselves," said Price. "Men do." "And yet," Julian said quietly, "no man was there." Father Brown approached him later, near the lich gate where the frost still clung stubbornly to the grass. "You knew Mr. Reed well?" he asked. Julian nodded. He believed the bells were alive, not in a foolish way, in a responsible way. Father Brown smiled faintly. Responsibility is often mistaken for superstition. Julian hesitated. He said silence could accuse. Father Brown's eyes lifted toward the tower. "Silence," he said gently, "is very articulate." That afternoon, Father Brown took tea at the vicarage, listening as the rector recounted the history of St. Aldhelm's bells, how they had been recast, rehung, silenced during wars, restored by careful hands. At no point did Father Brown interrupt. He merely asked once, "And who last rang them?" The answer was obvious. That evening, as dusk settled over Larchcombe, the village found itself quieter than usual. No one wished to hear the bells again. No one said so aloud. Father Brown walked the perimeter of the churchyard slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression thoughtful rather than troubled. He paused beneath the tower and looked up at the narrow windows, dark and patient. "Locked rooms," he murmured, "are rarely locked to keep people out." Somewhere inside the tower, the bells rested in silence. They had said enough for now. Chapter 2. By the second morning, Larchcombe had grown careful. It was not fear exactly, fear is loud and impatient, but a restrained attention, as though the village had learned that careless words might be overheard. Doors closed more softly. Conversations paused when someone approached. Even the children, usually quick to turn rumour into sport, were subdued by the severity of grown-up unease. The tower remained sealed. The constable returned early with a notebook that still looked unused, and with him came Dr. Lowe, whose professional composure had begun to acquire a faint edge. They climbed the narrow stair once more, not to discover anything new, but to reassure themselves that nothing had changed. Nothing had. The dust lay untouched, the ropes hung obediently in their places, the bells themselves were motionless, their bronze mouths open in a silence that felt deliberate. "It's as if the room refuses to remember," the constable muttered. "Rooms don't remember," Price replied sharply. "People do." Father Brown followed them more slowly, pausing often, not from fatigue, though he was not built for towers, but from interest. He examined the stones, the corners, the neglected places where no one expected meaning to settle. He said nothing until they reached the top. "Who locked the door?" he asked mildly. The constable blinked. "Mr. Reed always did. Habit." "And who unlocked it?" "I did," the constable replied. "With the church key." Father Brown nodded. "Habits are very trustworthy," he said, "until someone borrows them." They descended again, and the tower was sealed once more, as though it were an argument best left unfinished. By midday, Mr. Price had summoned a meeting in the parish hall. He believed, quite sincerely, that confusion could be disciplined out of existence. The long oak table was arranged with an unnecessary precision, and the chairs were placed at intervals that suggested both order and caution. "We are not," Price began, "entertaining superstition." Mrs. Fenwick stiffened. "You cannot dismiss what was heard." "I can," Price replied, "and I will. Bells do not ring without cause." "Nor do consciences," Father Brown said quietly, from the end of the table. Price ignored him. Dr. Lowe presented his findings with clinical restraint. There were no marks of violence consistent with a struggle, no evidence of intrusion. The cause of death remained uncertain, pending further examination, but it was not instantaneous. "He had time," Lowe said, choosing his words carefully. "Time to react." "To what?" Julian asked. "That," Lowe admitted, "is precisely the difficulty." Attention turned, slowly and inevitably, toward Julian Markham. He felt it before anyone spoke his name. It was the weight of expectation, not accusation, a far more dangerous thing. "You assisted Mr. Reed," Price said. "Yes." "You knew the tower, the bells?" "Yes." "And you were present in the church late that night?" Julian's jaw tightened. "Practicing," he said. "For Sunday?" Father Brown looked at him gently. "Music," he observed, "often brings people where they are already inclined to go." Julian flushed, unsure whether he had been defended or exposed. Mrs. Fenwick broke the tension. "You are all ignoring the sign." Price slammed his hand on the table. "Madam, there was no sign, only a crime." She stood. "The bells rang for judgment. Mr. Reed warned us. He said silence would accuse those who refused to speak." The room stilled. Father Brown leaned forward slightly. "And who," he asked softly, "was refusing to speak?" Mrs. Fenwick hesitated. "Those who mocked faith." "Or," Father Brown continued, "those who feared consequence." Her certainty wavered. The meeting dissolved without resolution, which satisfied no one and frightened most. Outside, the sky hung low and grey, as though withholding comment. That afternoon, Father Brown sought out Julian at the organ bench. The young man sat rigidly, hands resting in his lap, eyes fixed on the keys he had not touched since the night of the bells. "You loved the sound?" Father Brown said. Julian did not deny it. "I wanted it to speak," he admitted. "He wanted it to obey." "Obedience," Father Brown replied, "is often mistaken for silence." Julian's voice dropped. He knew something. Reed did. He said the bells remembered what men tried to forget. Father Brown considered this. Did he ever say what that was? Julian shook his head. Only that silence can be a form of violence. As evening approached, Father Brown walked again around the churchyard. He stopped near the tower, listening, not for sound, but for absence. Inside the tower, the bells were not merely silent, they were restrained. Father Brown returned to the vicarage, where the rector admitted, after some reluctance, that Mr. Reed had requested a private conversation the previous week. He seemed troubled, the rector said, spoke of confession, though not his own. And did he say why he did not speak sooner? The rector sighed. He said timing was a form of mercy. Father Brown smiled sadly. Timing, he said, is often pride wearing a halo. That night, Larchcombe slept poorly. Just before dawn, Father Brown woke with the quiet certainty that something had been misunderstood. He dressed and walked toward the church, the air sharp with frost and restraint. The tower stood as it had since the bells rang, closed, silent, and certain. Silence, Father Brown murmured, is never empty. And somewhere, beneath the weight of unspoken knowledge, the accusation deepened, not against a man, but against a choice made too late. Chapter 3. By the third day, the village had begun to explain the bells. This was not done publicly, nor with any official sanction, but privately and persistently, in kitchens and side chapels, in pauses during errands and glances exchanged across hedges. When reason fails to account for a thing, imagination supplies it, often with confidence, always with conviction. The explanation most favoured was the oldest, that the bells had been rung by the dead. Mrs. Fenwick did not say this directly. She merely allowed it to be understood. She spoke instead of warnings, of signs permitted by God when men refused to hear ordinary language. Others embroidered the idea with details she had not offered. By afternoon, the story had acquired a logic of its own. Father Brown heard it all without comment. He spent the morning seated in the side chapel, ostensibly reading, though his eyes remained on the worn stone floor, where countless feet had traced the same paths of habit and belief. He noticed who knelt and who did not, who glanced upward toward the tower, who avoided doing so. Near midday, a stranger arrived. He was introduced by the rector with a mixture of apology and deference, as one does when scholarship threatens to intrude upon tragedy. His name was Erasmus Bell, an unfortunate coincidence not lost on anyone, and he was, according to his own description, a historian of ecclesiastical acoustics. "I was passing through," Bell explained, removing his gloves with unnecessary precision. "When I heard of the incident, I thought it prudent to offer assistance." Mr. Price was immediately wary. "We are not conducting an inquiry into folklore." "Of course not," Bell replied pleasantly. "Only into structures, towers, sound transmission." Father Brown watched him closely. Bell was tall, narrow, and confident in the way of men who believed explanation was a form of mastery. His eyes moved constantly, not with curiosity, but with possession. Bell requested access to the tower. The constable hesitated, then looked to Price, who sighed and waved a hand. "Very well, but nothing is to be disturbed. Knowledge," Bell said lightly, "rarely disturbs anything except illusions." They climbed together, Bell leading with brisk assurance, Father Brown following at a distance. At the top, Bell circled the bells with growing interest, tapping here, measuring there, murmuring to himself in academic fragments. "You see," he said at last, "there are documented cases, rare but credible, of residual vibration. Stone, under certain conditions, can store resonance." "Like memory?" Father Brown asked. "Like echo," Bell corrected, "entirely mechanical." "And the locked door?" the constable asked. Bell smiled. "An echo requires no hands." Mrs. Fenwick, who had followed despite no invitation, clasped her shawl tighter. "Then you admit it, that the bells answered a call?" "I admit," Bell replied, "that sound is not as obedient as we imagine." Father Brown said nothing. That afternoon, Bell presented his theory to a small gathering in the parish hall. He spoke of medieval design, of hidden cavities and pressure changes, of rare but measurable phenomena. His words were careful, impressive, and utterly convincing to those who wished to be convinced. Price listened with visible relief. "So there is no mystery?" "On the contrary," Bell said, "there is an explanation." Father Brown watched Julian, who stood at the back, arms folded, expression closed. Later, Father Brown found Julian outside, pacing the churchyard path, worn smooth by centuries of mourning. "You do not believe him," the priest observed. Julian shook his head. "I believe the bells," he said, "and they don't lie like that." Father Brown raised an eyebrow gently. "How do they lie?" Julian hesitated. "By sounding without intention. Mr. Reed would never have allowed that." "And if intention came from elsewhere?" Julian stopped. "You mean another man?" Father Brown did not answer. That evening, Father Brown paid a visit to Bell's lodgings at the inn. The historian received him cordially, offering tea and enthusiasm in equal measure. "You are skeptical," Bell said, pouring. "That is admirable. Clergymen should be." "I am attentive," Father Brown replied. "There is a difference." Bell laughed. "You Catholics have a way of making observations sound like virtue." Father Brown smiled. "Virtue," he said, "is merely observation acted upon." They spoke of bells, of relics rumoured to be sealed into towers during reformations, of old legends dismissed and revived according to fashion. Some believed, Bell said, that certain bells rang only when great sin demanded exposure. "And did you believe that?" Father Brown asked. Bell paused. "I believe that belief itself has power." "Enough," Father Brown said gently, "to make men reckless?" Bell's smile thinned. "Revelation often requires risk." Father Brown left shortly after, declining a second cup. Night settled heavily. Just before midnight, Father Brown woke again, not from sound, but from its absence. He dressed and walked toward the church, his steps unhurried. The tower loomed above him, silent and still. Then faintly he heard it. Not ringing, not echoing. A breath. The softest vibration, like metal cooling or wood adjusting itself to the night. Father Brown closed his eyes. "This," he murmured, "is what everyone missed." The bells had not rung, they had waited, and someone, living, fearful, and very much human, had known how to make silence speak. Chapter 4. By the fourth day, certainty had become a liability. The village no longer argued about what had happened in the bell tower. It arranged itself around explanations like furniture hastily pushed to conceal a stain. Erasmus Bell's theory had provided something worse than comfort. It had provided closure without understanding. Men repeated his phrases as though repetition itself could transform possibility into fact. Father Brown noticed who used those phrases most. Mr. Price repeated them loudly. The constable used them cautiously. Mrs. Fenwick used them reverently, as though science and sanctity had at last shaken hands. Julian Markham used none of them at all. Father Brown found him in the bell tower late in the afternoon, standing not beneath the bells but near the wall, staring at a place where nothing appeared remarkable. "You're measuring," Father Brown said. Julian started. "No, I'm remembering." He gestured toward the wall. "Mr. Reed used to lean here, always the same spot. Said the bells were heavier when you stood too close." "He was wrong," Father Brown replied. Julian frowned. "How do you know?" "Because bells," Father Brown said, "are not heavy in that way. Responsibility is." Julian looked at him sharply, then away. They descended in silence. Outside, Father Brown noticed something he had not before, not because it had changed, but because he had. The grass beneath the tower window was flattened in an uneven arc, as though something narrow and vertical had rested there for some time. A ladder, perhaps. He did not mention it. That evening, Father Brown joined Mr. Price and the constable for supper at the rectory. The conversation circled politely, avoiding conclusions while leaning heavily upon them. "The tower was sealed," Price insisted. "No one entered or exited." "No one exited through the door," Father Brown agreed. The constable shifted. "We checked the windows." "Yes," Father Brown said. "You checked them for men." They looked at him. "Bells," he continued mildly, "are not moved by men. They are moved by ropes, and ropes may be guided without hands." Price snorted. "You're suggesting a mechanism?" "I'm suggesting," Father Brown said, "a habit." The rector changed the subject. Later that night, Father Brown walked the perimeter of the church. He stopped beneath the tower window and examined the stonework closely. The mortar was old, friable. One narrow groove ran downward, shallow but unmistakable. A rope had passed there. Inside the tower, Father Brown climbed the narrow stair and stood alone. He did not touch the bells. Instead, he followed the rope path with his eyes, tracing it downward. At the base, he found it. A pulley, small, rusted, recently used. It had been installed not recently enough to shine, but too recently to belong to the medieval design. A modern addition disguised by neglect. Father Brown smiled faintly. "Silence," he murmured, "is rarely empty." The next morning, he requested to speak with Mrs. Fenwick. She received him stiffly, her sitting room arranged with devotional exactitude. Nothing was out of place, and that, Father Brown noticed, was the trouble. "You believe the bells spoke," he said gently. "They warned," she corrected. "And yet," Father Brown said, "you slept through the ringing." She stiffened. "I was at prayer." "At midnight?" he asked. "Yes." "In your upstairs room?" Father Brown continued. Her eyes flickered. "You see," Father Brown said, "the bells did not wake you. You were waiting." Her voice sharpened. "Waiting for what?" "For permission," he replied. She said nothing. Father Brown stood. "Fear," he said, "often dresses itself as faith because it is ashamed to appear alone." He left her in silence. That afternoon, he found Erasmus Bell in the church, sketching the tower with professional absorption. "You did not mention the pulley?" Father Brown observed. Bell looked up sharply. "What pulley?" "The one that does not belong," Father Brown said. "The one installed by someone who wanted the bells to answer." Bell laughed. "You think I missed that?" "No," Father Brown replied. "I think you ignored it." Bell's expression hardened. "You accuse me of deception." "I accuse you," Father Brown said, "of preference." "For explanation?" "For spectacle." Bell closed his notebook. "The truth requires demonstration." "The truth," Father Brown replied, "requires restraint." Bell's voice dropped. "You are afraid of what proof might reveal." "I am afraid," Father Brown said calmly, "of what men do when they believe proof excuses them." They parted without resolution. That evening, Julian sought out Father Brown. "I found something," he said, breathless. He led the priest to the tower base and pointed toward the pulley. "This wasn't here before, or if it was, no one used it." Father Brown nodded. "It was used once, very carefully." Julian swallowed. "Then the ringing wasn't not supernatural," Father Brown said, "and not accidental." "Who?" Julian asked. Father Brown looked at the bells above them. "Someone," he said, "who believed silence was safer than speech." Julian's face darkened. "Mr. Reed argued with someone the night before." Father Brown turned. "About what?" "About reporting irregularities in the tower," Julian said. "About telling the rector that the bells were being altered." "And did he?" Father Brown asked. Julian shook his head. "He said it wasn't his place." Father Brown closed his eyes briefly. "There it is," he said. "What?" Julian asked. "The murder," Father Brown replied quietly, "was not committed at midnight." Julian stared. "It was committed earlier," Father Brown continued, "when a man chose not to speak. The bells, Father Brown knew, had not accused the dead, they had accused the living. And someone, frightened, clever, and convinced of their own necessity, had decided to make sure that accusation could not be denied. Chapter 5. The village had grown watchful, not suspicious in the crude sense, but inwardly alert, like a room where someone has quietly closed the door and no one remembers doing it. Conversation softened when Father Brown approached. Faces held smiles a moment too long. The bells were no longer rung, yet their absence seemed louder than their presence had ever been. Father Brown did not hurry matters. He knew that truth, like music, often requires the right silence to emerge. He began that morning not at the church, but at the riverside. The water ran thin and bright beneath a weak sun, edged with frost that refused to melt. Dr. Lowe stood nearby, casting pebbles into the current with clinical detachment. "You examine what moves," Father Brown said mildly, "to understand what does not." Dr. Lowe glanced at him. "I examine what can be measured." "And yet," Father Brown replied, "you signed the death certificate." The doctor stiffened. "I observed the body." "And what did you not observe?" Father Brown asked. Dr. Lowe hesitated. "The time," he admitted. "It was ambiguous." Father Brown nodded. "Because death had already done its work elsewhere." Dr. Lowe frowned. "You think he was dead before the bells?" "I think," Father Brown said, "that men often confuse sound with cause." The doctor said nothing more. Later that day, Father Brown paid a call on Mr. Price. The man's house was immaculate, as though order itself were a defense. Papers lay stacked in precise alignment. "You are uncomfortable," Father Brown said gently. Price laughed sharply. "I dislike disorder." "And guilt," Father Brown added. Price froze. "I do not accuse," Father Brown said quickly. "I observe." Price exhaled. "We all failed him." "Yes," Father Brown said, "but some failures weigh more than others." Price looked away. He wanted to report changes to the tower, claimed someone was interfering. "And you advised silence," Father Brown said. "It was not his decision to make," Price snapped. "The church has processes." "Truth," Father Brown replied, "has urgency." That evening, Father Brown requested a meeting, not public, but present. The rector, Erasmus Bell, Mrs. Fenwick, Dr. Lowe, Julian, and the constable gathered in the nave. The church was unlit except by candles. The bells remained still. Father Brown stood near the front, hands folded. "I will not name a murderer tonight," he said calmly. A ripple of unease passed through them. "I will speak instead of choice." Erasmus Bell smiled thinly. "You disappoint us." Father Brown inclined his head. "Truth often does." He turned to Mrs. Fenwick. "You believed the bells were judgment." She nodded stiffly. "And you," Father Brown continued, turning to Bell, "believed they were proof." Bell's eyes narrowed. "And you," Father Brown said to Price, "believed silence was safety." Price swallowed. "Each of you," Father Brown said, "heard the same sound. Each of you interpreted it to excuse your fear." Julian shifted. "What does this have to do with Mr. Reed?" "Everything," Father Brown said. He moved to the tower door and placed his hand upon it. "Mr. Reed discovered an alteration," Father Brown continued, "a pulley installed to allow the bells to be rung from below without entering the tower." Bell stiffened. "He intended to speak," Father Brown said, "but he was persuaded not to." "By whom?" the constable asked. "By conscience," Father Brown replied, "which is easily confused with caution." Silence thickened. "Later," Father Brown continued, "someone feared that silence would not hold, so they created a spectacle, midnight bells, to drown doubt in awe." Bell laughed bitterly. "You accuse me again." "I accuse no one," Father Brown said. "I describe a soul." He turned to Erasmus Bell fully. "You wanted your theory to be true. You wanted the bells to obey intellect." Bell's voice rose. "Because intellect brings order." "Not without humility," Father Brown replied. Bell's face flushed. "You think I killed him?" "I think," Father Brown said quietly, "that you confronted him." Bell's breath quickened. "You argued," Father Brown continued. "He threatened to report the mechanism. You panicked, not with rage, but with necessity." Bell shook his head. "No." "You pushed him," Father Brown said gently. "Not to kill, to silence." Julian gasped. "The fall," Father Brown continued, "did the rest." Belle collapsed into a pew. "I did not mean," Belle whispered. "No one ever does," Father Brown said softly. Mrs. Fenwick wept silently. The constable stepped forward. Father Brown raised a hand. "Let him speak." Belle covered his face. "I told myself it was an accident," he said, "that the bells would sanctify it." "They cannot," Father Brown replied. "They only echo what we place within them." The constable took Belle away. The others remained, shaken. Father Brown turned to Julian. "You must play again." Julian nodded, tears in his eyes. Not now, Father Brown thought, but soon. Chapter 6. Erasmus Bell did not resist arrest. That fact alone unsettled the village more than any midnight ringing ever had. The constable led him away at dawn, his coat buttoned too carefully, his head bowed not in shame, but in calculation, as though he were still attempting to catalogue events into acceptable categories. No one spoke as he passed. The bells did not move. Father Brown watched from the churchyard, hands tucked into his sleeves, eyes lowered. He had not come to witness justice, but consequence, a subtler, heavier thing. By mid-morning, St. Aldhelm's felt hollowed. People entered the church not to pray, but to confirm that it still stood, that the stone walls had not shifted during the night. Some touched the pews as if they might recoil. Others avoided the tower altogether. Julian Markham arrived early, carrying sheet music he did not intend to use. He stood beneath the loft, staring upward, uncertain whether to climb. "You need not yet," Father Brown said from behind him. Julian turned. "I hear it even now." "Hear what?" "The expectation," Julian replied, "as if the church is waiting to be answered." Father Brown smiled faintly. "Churches are patient listeners." Julian hesitated. "Do you think he repented?" Father Brown did not answer immediately. "I think," he said at last, "that regret is not repentance, but it is often the door through which repentance must pass." They sat together in silence. Later that afternoon, Dr. Lowe sought Father Brown in the vestry. His expression had lost its professional detachment. Something raw had taken its place. "I testified," the doctor said. "Truthfully?" Father Brown nodded. "That is rarely easy." "No," Lowe replied. "It dismantles one's excuses." Father Brown looked at him kindly. "Excuses are only lies we tell ourselves in polite language." Lowe swallowed. "I dismissed the early bruising. Told myself it was irrelevant. And now?" "And now," Lowe said quietly, "I know that indifference can be a kind of violence." Father Brown rested a hand briefly on the man's sleeve. "Knowing that," he said, "is the beginning of repair." Not all were ready for repair. Mr. Price refused to enter the church that day. He remained at the gate, hat in hand, staring toward the tower with a face lined by resentment rather than grief. "He embarrassed us," Price muttered when Father Brown approached. "He made a spectacle." "Truth often appears theatrical," Father Brown replied, "to those who have rehearsed silence." Price scoffed. "We will be remembered for this." "Yes," Father Brown said, "but not in the way you fear." Price turned sharply. "You think this makes us humble?" "I think," Father Brown said gently, "that humility is not something done to us, is something we finally permit." That evening, the rector announced a closed service, not public, not ceremonial. Only those directly involved were invited, no bells would ring, candles lined the nave. The light they cast was uneven, revealing cracks in the stone that no one had noticed before. Father Brown sat near the back. The rector spoke briefly of accountability, then stepped aside. No hymns followed. Instead, Julian rose and approached the organ. He did not sit at once. He stood, resting his hands on the bench, breathing as though steadying himself against an unseen wind. Then he sat, not triumphantly, but carefully. He played nothing elaborate. A plain melody unfolded, halting at first, then steadier, like a confession learning to speak. The sound did not rise toward the tower, but remained grounded, filling the church without urgency or demand. Father Brown watched the faces around him. Mrs. Fenwick wept quietly, her hands clenched, her earlier certainty undone not by argument, but by gentleness. Dr. Lowe bowed his head. Even Price, standing at the back, closed his eyes. The music ended without flourish. Silence followed. It was not empty. Father Brown stood. Mr. Reed believed, he said softly, that sound carries responsibility, that those entrusted with it must first listen. He paused. He was killed not because he spoke, but because someone feared what his speaking would require of them. No one protested. Justice, Father Brown continued, will now proceed, but justice alone does not restore order. Only truth, accepted freely, can do that. Julian looked down. And the bells? Father Brown smiled faintly. They are not witnesses, they are instruments. The service ended quietly. Later that night, Father Brown climbed the tower alone. He did not light a candle. The narrow stairs creaked beneath his steps, not ominously, but familiarly, like old joints. At the top, the bells hung still, their bronze surfaces dulled by age and touch. He laid a hand against one. "It was never you," he murmured. He noticed the pulley mechanism, the one Reed had discovered. It had been removed hastily, leaving marks where it had been anchored. The absence spoke louder than its presence ever had. Father Brown descended slowly. Outside, frost had begun to settle again. The village lay quiet, as though exhausted by its own vigilance. Julian waited near the gate. "I don't know if I deserve to play," he said. Father Brown adjusted his hat. "Deserving is a poor measure. Willingness is better." Julian nodded. "Remember," Father Brown added, "that pride seeks applause, humility seeks accuracy." Julian smiled faintly. "And the bells?" "They will ring again," Father Brown said, "but not yet. Silence still has work to do." As Father Brown walked away, the church remained behind him, unchanged in form, altered in meaning. The bells did not move, but for the first time since the murder they did not accuse, they waited. Chapter 7. The bells were not rung for several days after the arrest. This was not by decree or instruction. No notice was posted, no argument raised. The silence simply continued, accepted by the village with a wary gratitude, as one accepts the quiet after a storm without daring to ask whether it has truly passed. Life resumed in smaller motions, shops reopened with shorter hours, conversations lengthened, then faltered, then found their way again. St. Aldhelm's stood with its doors ajar from morning until dusk, as if inviting the hesitant to enter without promising comfort. People came not to kneel immediately, but to sit, to look, to be present without obligation. Father Brown remained. He had delayed his departure once more, not from duty, but from attentiveness. He had learned long ago that endings rarely conclude where they announce themselves. Some truths, like seeds, required time beneath the surface. Julian Markham practiced daily, though never at the same hour. He insisted the loft remain open, the ladder unlatched. He did not wish to be alone with the instrument, nor to conceal himself above those who listened. He played softly, often stopping mid-phrase, allowing quiet to settle before beginning again. The music wandered through the church like a visitor, unsure of welcome, gradually becoming familiar. One afternoon, Mrs. Fenwick approached him as he descended the stairs. "I wanted to tell you," she said, struggling to meet his eyes, "that I was wrong." Julian shook his head. "We all were?" She pressed her lips together. I wanted the bells to mean something extraordinary. I wanted fear to feel holy. Julian considered this. Perhaps, he said gently, holiness is what remains when fear leaves. She nodded, her shoulders loosening as though she had set down a burden she had been carrying without knowing its weight. Nearby, Mr. Price watched the exchange with an expression that suggested irritation rather than curiosity. Later, he found Father Brown near the lich gate, examining the worn inscriptions on the stones. You stayed, Price said. You usually leave? Father Brown smiled. Usually, yes. And why not now? Because, Father Brown replied, this village has learned something, and learning is fragile before it becomes habit. Price folded his arms. You think us better people now? No, Father Brown said. I think you are more honest ones. Price scoffed. Honesty is expensive. Yes, Father Brown agreed, but deceit is ruinous. That evening, Dr. Lowe hosted a small gathering at his home. Not a celebration, not a condolence, a conversation. The sort of gathering that acknowledged unease rather than dispelling it. Father Brown attended quietly, sitting near the hearth. They spoke of ordinary things at first, the coming frost, the price of coal, the condition of the roads. Eventually, inevitably, the subject returned to the tower. I keep thinking, Lowe said, about what I failed to see. Father Brown stirred his tea. Sight, he said, is not merely a function of the eyes. Lowe nodded. I believed myself objective. And were you? I was comfortable, Lowe replied. I mistook that for objectivity. Father Brown smiled faintly. Comfort is often the enemy of truth. It dulls the conscience gently, so we do not notice the loss. Later that night, Father Brown returned alone to St. Aldhelm's. The moonlight filtered through the stained glass, painting the nave in pale, fractured colours. He did not sit in the pews. Instead, he stood beneath the tower, gazing upward. You see, he said softly, as though continuing an old conversation. Objects remember how they are used, not with memory, but with tendency. The wood creaked faintly above him, settling. The bells did not accuse, he continued. They obeyed. He thought of Bell's certainty, Reed's restraint, Julian's struggle, the villagers' longing for meaning that did not demand responsibility. Meaning, Father Brown murmured, is always costly. That is why we are tempted by spectacle instead. The next morning, the rector announced a modest service of remembrance. No names engraved, no proclamations, simply acknowledgement. The church filled gradually. Julian waited until the final hymn before approaching the organ. He played a simple setting, unadorned, leaving space between phrases. The sound did not climb the tower, it remained among the people, supporting rather than commanding. Father Brown closed his eyes. This, he thought, is restitution. After the service, no one hurried away. Conversations were subdued, but sincere. There was no applause. That would have been a mistake. Near the gate, Julian approached Father Brown. I'm afraid, he admitted, that I will forget what this felt like. Father Brown smiled. You will? Julian frowned. Then what good is it? Because, Father Brown said, we do not build truth to remember feelings. We build habits to remember truth when feelings fade. Julian considered this. Will you return? Father Brown adjusted his hat. If the bells begin asking metaphysical questions again, perhaps. They shared a quiet laugh. As Father Brown prepared to leave, Mrs. Fenwick pressed a small parcel into his hands. For the road, she said simply. Mr. Price offered a handshake that lingered longer than necessary. Dr. Lowe nodded, his expression thoughtful. Father Brown walked down the path as the sun dipped low, the frost beginning its slow work once more. Behind him, St. Aldhelm stood unchanged in stone, altered in spirit. From within, the organ sounded, not loudly, not ceremonially. A rehearsal, a working sound, the sound of order returning without proclamation. Father Brown did not turn back. He knew now that the village would not need him again, not for this. The bells would ring when they were meant to. The silence had done its work. And silence, when properly listened to, always tells the truth. Chapter 8. The morning Father Brown left St. Aldhelm's arrived without ceremony. There was no frost that day, no mist rising theatrically from the fields, no bells to mark the hour. The sky was a soft, undecided grey, as though the weather itself had not yet chosen a conclusion. Father Brown preferred such mornings. They asked nothing. He rose early before the village had fully stirred and packed his small bag with deliberate care. There was little to gather: his breviary, a worn book of essays, the parcel Mrs. Fenwick had pressed upon him, and a folded note from the rector written in a hand that still seemed unsure whether gratitude should be spoken aloud. Before leaving, Father Brown returned once more to the church. The doors were unlocked, as they had been most days since the trouble ended. Inside, the air held a faint trace of polish and candle wax, mingled with something older, stone cooled by centuries of waiting. The nave was empty. Even the pigeons that sometimes ventured inside were absent, as if respecting a boundary they could not name. Father Brown walked slowly, his footsteps soft against the worn floor. He did not climb the tower. Instead, he stood beneath it, looking upward, his hands folded loosely before him. The bells remained still above, their ropes neatly tied, patient rather than dormant. "So," he said quietly, "we have finished speaking." The church did not answer, and he did not expect it to. Answers, he knew, were rarely the purpose of such conversations. He moved toward the organ loft ladder, paused, then turned away. Some gestures, he believed, lost their meaning if repeated too often. The truth had been revealed there already. To return again would be indulgence rather than insight. From the back of the church, a sound reached him, the creak of the door. Julian Markham entered, looking startled to find Father Brown still there. "I hoped I might catch you," Julian said. "I heard you were leaving today." Father Brown smiled. "So it seems." Julian hesitated, then said, "I wanted to thank you." "For what?" Father Brown asked. "For not telling me what to play," Julian replied. "For trusting me with silence." Father Brown considered this. "Silence," he said, "is the one thing we cannot fake. That is why it frightens us." Julian nodded. "I think I understand now why Harcourt waited as long as he did." "Yes," Father Brown said. "He was not indecisive. He was faithful." Julian looked up toward the loft. "Do you think he would forgive us?" Father Brown smiled gently. "Forgiveness," he said, "is not something the dead grant. It is something the living learn to accept." They stood together for a moment longer. Then Julian extended his hand. Father Brown took it, briefly, warmly. Outside, the village was waking. A cart passed along the lane. A child ran ahead of it, laughing. Smoke curled from chimneys in modest threads. Life, unremarkable and persistent, had resumed its quiet claim. Mrs. Fenwick watched from her doorway as Father Brown passed. She did not call out, she only inclined her head, and he returned the gesture. At the edge of the green, Mr. Price waited, pretending unconvincingly, to examine a notice board. "You didn't say goodbye," Price remarked. "Goodbyes," Father Brown said, "are often mistaken for conclusions." Price gave a short laugh. "You're an infuriating man." "So I'm told." Price hesitated. "I've been thinking about certainty," he said, "about how easily it hardens into something dangerous." Father Brown nodded. "Conviction must kneel," he said, "otherwise it becomes tyranny." Price extended his hand. This time the gesture was simpler, honest. As Father Brown continued down the path, the village fell gradually behind him. The church tower remained visible for some distance, rising above the rooftops, neither accusing nor beckoning, simply present. Near the bend in the road, Father Brown paused. From behind him, faintly, came the sound of the organ, not a service, not a performance, practice. The notes were measured, restrained, almost tentative. They did not rush toward beauty. They seemed content with truth. Father Brown smiled. "That," he murmured, "is how penance sounds." He resumed his walk, the rhythm of his steps unhurried, his thoughts lightened by the peculiar satisfaction of a mystery resolved without triumph. As the path narrowed and the hedgerows closed in, he reflected, as he often did, on the nature of judgment. The bells had not spoken of wrath, the tower had not proclaimed doom. The crime itself had not been born of cruelty, but of certainty untempered by humility. Each person involved had acted from what they believed to be devotion to truth, to reason, to beauty, to meaning. That, Father Brown thought, is what makes sin so persuasive. It often begins as virtue that refuses correction. The relic remained sealed in its wooden box, its anonymity restored. It had never mattered whether it was genuine or false. Its power had been entirely borrowed from fear, from pride, from longing. Truth, Father Brown believed, did not require artifacts. It required attention. At the crest of the hill, he stopped once more and looked back. St. Aldhelm's stood quiet beneath the pale sky, its windows catching the light without explanation. The tower rose as it always had, not announcing miracles, not threatening judgment. Waiting. The organ fell silent again, the sound fading naturally, without drama. The village continued its business, untroubled by the absence of spectacle. Father Brown adjusted his hat and turned away. There would be other villages, other certainties, other crimes committed not by monsters, but by ordinary men who mistook conviction for righteousness. He walked on, carrying nothing but a small bag and a larger understanding that justice, when rightly ordered, did not shout, that truth, when finally heard, often arrived as quiet relief, and that the most enduring sound was not accusation, nor even confession, but the calm that follows when conscience is allowed to rest. The road curved out of sight. Behind him, St. Aldhelm's waited, not for fear, not for signs, not for judgment, but for those willing to listen when the bells rang again, and to understand when they did not. And in that patient silence, the story ended exactly where it belonged, not with noise, but with order restored.